president's opponents have urged him to respond with force. But how do you break the so-called axis of resistance? And can that be done without sparking a much wider conflict? Plus,
there is no time to grieve here in Gaza. Everyone knows that. You feel sad, you cry, okay, get up, go find water and food.
As a ceasefire deal is reportedly presented to Hamas, today we hear from the young people inside Gaza hoping for a pause. I'll ask the former head of US Central Command whether Joe Biden can really afford to hit Iran hard. And coming up, I'll speak live to the head of Survival International and ask why she's pressuring Prince Harry to quit a wildlife charity working in the Congo. Plus, Oscar nominee Lily Gladstone on the need for more Native American stories in Hollywood and in the classroom. That's all coming up on The World with me, Yalda Hakim. Good evening. We begin tonight with the dilemma facing US President Joe Biden. After 3 US service members were killed in a drone strike on their camp inside Jordan, his political rivals are demanding that he hit Iran hard. But it's not a simple decision. Whatever he does next will have repercussions across a region already on edge. We now know the deadly attack was likely carried out by an armed militia funded by Tehran. It's the latest in a string of almost daily strikes targeting American troops in Iraq and Syria since October the 7th. So far, the US has been careful not to directly engage, but now it may not have a choice. Tonight, we'll examine Iran's complex web of proxies, from the so-called axis of resistance to the criminal gangs subjected to yet more sanctions today. And we'll see the video diaries from Gaza, where many still hope the ceasefire now being discussed could end what they call their living nightmare. But let's get started in Washington with that crucial decision facing President Biden and his military advisors. James Matthews has our first report.
2 days after the attack on the base by the Jordanian border, US officials have released new details. In a corner of the country where US troops train with Jordanian forces, the enemy drone approached the base as a US drone was coming into land. There was confusion over whether the explosive device was friend or foe, and so it breached the base defences.
This demonstrates once again the risk that...
In a pre-arranged meeting with NATO Secretary-General, the US Defense Secretary addressed America's response.
The President and I will not tolerate attack on US forces, and we will take all necessary actions to defend the US and our troops.
US and UK forces have already struck at Iranian-backed militia for a wave of attacks across the Middle East. America has pointed the finger of blame in the same direction for the fatal attack. The United States hasn't said what its response will be, but it has spoken of fundamental change.
It's fundamentally different now because we have 3 families who just got the worst possible news. That's different.
President Biden has met in the White House Situation Room with members of his National Security Council, the cast of characters who would formulate America's response. Biden's challenge is to craft a course that asserts American authority and reinforces deterrence without escalating conflict. He posted this from the Situation Room as Qatar's Prime Minister discussed the situation with the US Secretary of State and his concerns as he brokers a new deal to release hostages.
I hope that nothing would undermine the efforts that we are doing or jeopardize the process, yet it will definitely have an impact on it, and will, one way or another, it will have an impact on the regional security, and we hope that things get contained and not to get escalated beyond control.
Amidst questions over whether US retaliation will involve a strike in Iran itself, Tehran has denied involvement in the Jordanian attack.
Resistance groups across the region do not take orders from the Islamic Republic of Iran. The Islamic Republic of Iran, while it does not welcome expansion of conflicts in the region, doesn't interfere in decision-making by resistance groups.
At church on Sunday, Joe Biden paused in silence for those Americans killed. a president reflecting on events past and to come. James Matthews, Sky News in Washington.
Well, Joe Biden's dilemma is made even more complex because of Iran's role as puppet master in the region. Well, our international correspondent Alex Rossi is with me now. And Alex, for months we've heard the US say we're trying to avoid escalation, but that's exactly what's happened now here. And what we've seen is exactly that, escalation.
Yalda, we are now coming to an inflection point, and in many ways this is what Joe Biden and his administration were really trying to avoid. They were hoping to avoid. Remember that the policy that the United States has pursued since October the 7th has been one of unalloyed, unbridled support for the Israelis, but at the same time trying to contain the fire from spreading across the region. But it is spreading. Remember now where this theatre has opened up: Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Israel, Gaza, and now, of course, with these surface personnel in Jordan as well. 3 armed forces members killed. He has to respond. He has to try to restore his deterrent. How he does that, it's difficult. There aren't any good choices, but it comes to either sending a very convincing, strong message in a region where hard power is respected, or looking weak. And as far as many of these actors in the region are concerned, the United States is already looking weak tonight.
Yeah, so talk us through the options then. What are some of the options that Biden has?
Well, this is, what he's being pushed to do domestically is, I suppose, the kind of big red button option, and that is a direct strike in Iran. The calculation, of course, is that all of this chaos that we're seeing across the region really starts in Tehran, and you need to send a very convincing message to Tehran to desist and stop it. And by striking on Iranian soil, you do that. But of course, the risk is that actually you set off a chain reaction across the region which worsens things. But to do nothing, again, this cycle continues. We've had 170 attacks so far on US forces, and this one was deadly. So they have to do something. When they do it, again, we don't know. I suspect it will be seriously thought about, calibrated. There will be things that they can look at, certain things that they can hit. But I think they'll take their time. Going back from hitting Iran, they could hit, say, Iran revolutionary forces in Iraq or Syria. That would be another option. And I suppose the least option that they could do is target the militias who perpetrated this attack on US forces.
Yeah, as you say, a number of options there that we will continue to discuss on the programme. Alex, thanks so much. Well, Alex was just talking there about the American options. In the last few minutes, the US Secretary of State echoed President Biden's warnings that those responsible for the killing of US troops will be held responsible. Have a listen.
We've been very clear in warning that anyone looking to take advantage of conflict in the Middle East and try to expand it, don't do it. We've taken steps to defend ourselves and to defend our partners, as well as to prevent escalation. And the President's been crystal clear. We will respond decisively to any aggression. And we will hold responsible the people who attacked our troops. We'll do so at a time and a place of our choosing.
US Secretary of State Antony Blinken speaking there. Let's cross live now to the Jordanian capital, Amman, and speak to our international affairs editor, Dominic Waghorn. And Dom, we're just hearing there from Tony Blinken, who says we will strike and we'll do it at a time of our choosing. But no real good options there for President Biden.
No, it's a dilemma, as Alex was saying there. We're getting a bit more from the Americans as to how this attack happened or how they think it may have happened. They say there may have been some confusion about the drone that was launched by this Iranian-backed militia, they say, to attack the base, but also a drone that they had sent out themselves, the Americans, on some kind of mission that was coming back at the same time. and may have then led to the air defences being down. Now, if that's the case, the Iranian-backed militia has obviously seen possibly and exploited a gap in the air defences to get their drone in and to get into attack a residential compound inside the base and kill these 3 American soldiers. And they're now saying they think that at least 40 soldiers were injured, up from the 34 they were saying yesterday. So for all those reasons, and also for the fact that this is the worst loss of life for American soldiers for some years since an attack on the US military in Kabul in 2021. For all those reasons, obviously, Joe Biden has to respond with force. He's not saying, or none of his officials are saying when or how, but he is going to have to respond with force. The question is exactly how he's going to do it.
Yeah, exactly. And just to reiterate what the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken was saying, he said the response against Iran could be multi-leveled and come in stages and be sustained over time. But there are dangers involved in this kind of retaliation.
Huge dangers for the president and for the region, of course. Now, I think he's under pressure in a couple of ways. One, in terms of America's standing in the region, because it has to restore its power of deterrence, particularly if it's true that this militia has just got through by kind of tricking its way in while another drone was possibly coming in as well. So that is undermining America's deterrence here, and in the rules of the rough neighbourhood that is the Middle East, as Alex was saying there, to show weakness is to encourage your enemies to do their worst. And in this case, the Americans believe the enemy is not just the militia that launched this drone, but Iran that is backing it. And at the moment like this, America cannot encourage Iran to think that America is weak. But also the president is under pressure in terms of domestic politics, of course, in an election year. He can't appear strong, he can't risk appearing weak. He has to appear strong, but also he has to avoid the danger of getting drawn into a much bigger war, because obviously his presumed rival Donald Trump is making a big virtue of keeping America out of forever from wars. So it's going to have to be a well-calibrated decision by the American president. And I think it's fair to say that the region, a tinderbox, as it has been since October the 7th, is at a pretty nerve-wracking moment this evening.
Dom, thank you so much for that update there from Amman. Well, the question that we've been posing today is how will the United States respond? My next guest can provide some insight. General Kenneth McKenzie Jr. was commander of US Central Command between 2019 and 2022. General McKenzie, thank you so much for joining us here on the programme. I mean, sooner or later, this was going to happen. Iran was going to cross some kind of US red line, and it feels like it has happened. General McKenzie, can you hear me? OK, we'll try and get General McKenzie back on, who was, as we said, the commander of the Central Command between 2019 and 2022. He was actually 4 years ago the commander of US forces who, under his command, ordered when President Trump ordered the killing of Qasem Soleimani, who was killed in Baghdad. So that was 4 years ago. As soon as we do get General McKenzie back, we will get him up to respond to some of our questions. But just to reiterate what the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken was also saying, that the response against Iran could be multi-leveled, come in stages and be sustained. Well, let's... oh, no, I'm told we have General McKenzie back on the line. General McKenzie, can you hear me this time?
I can see and hear you just fine.
Thank you so much for joining us. What I was asking was that sooner or later it felt like this was going to happen. Some kind of US red line was going to be crossed by Iran.
The Iranians have a primary strategic goal of ejecting us from the Middle East. They've been pursuing this goal for years before the Gaza war. They'll pursue it after the Gaza war ends. This is fundamental to their strategic approach, so we should expect it to continue. And it will continue so long as we don't make it too costly for them to do so. And we have obviously failed to deter them from these kinds of actions.
In fact, you know, what you say is that escalation is needed for deterrence.
I think by our messaging that de-escalation and preventing escalation is our highest priority, we send a very wrong signal. If preventing escalation is our highest priority, we need to leave the region. We need to get out. There'll be no possibility of escalation then. Clearly, that's not actually our highest priority. And we have to accept the risk of escalation if we aim to reestablish deterrence in, as your reporter said, this very dangerous neighborhood that understands the use of force.
You, 4 years ago, under your command, the commander of the Quds Force, Qasem Soleimani, was killed in Baghdad. Just help us understand the difference in terms of decision-making then to what's happening now.
We were under clear threat. We believe that Qasem Soleimani was going into Baghdad to continue to coordinate attacks against not only our embassy, but other forces in the region. He was a clear and present danger. And the decision then was to remove him from the battlefield so that he would not be able to coordinate those attacks. As a result of that, we've seen that the Iranians have found it harder to bring their militant groups together in Iraq and in Syria. So it had an effect. And I do believe it did establish deterrence with Iran. Iran has always clearly understood our military capabilities. They have always had doubts about our will. And the strike on Qasem Soleimani required them to recalibrate our will. We're at that stage now where to them at least, our lack of will in proposing and executing reasonable deterrence measures, it led to the attack that we saw yesterday.
Well, the Biden administration has argued that they're trying to de-escalate this situation and therefore doing nothing. But we're now, looking at sort of 170 strikes on U.S. forces and their bases over the past few months.
The attacker yesterday was the natural and inevitable result of not responding earlier in a way and in a language that those in the region would understand, and that would be the language of force.
So, General McKenzie, help us understand, when you say language of force, what do you mean? What are the options now on the table for the president?
Well, early in your broadcast, your reporters outlined several of them. We have the option of striking the militia that struck us directly. We can go after them. We should consider perhaps going after the source, which is Iran. That doesn't necessarily mean striking mainland Iran. There are other Iranian IRGC, Republican Guards targets around the region. And we shouldn't rule out any geographic area as we contemplate our response. But if we're going to respond, we need to make sure that it's something that actually has an effect on the enemy. And sometimes our responses over the past have not achieved that objective.
Yeah, I mean, do you think that perhaps, this kind of playing whack-a-mole with proxies that Iran may view as expendable?
Well, I think we all agree the root cause of the problem is Iran. And so perhaps we should consider what we do with and to Iran more centrally as we confront this problem.
So would you say then, just as you were ordered to strike Qasem Soleimani, that the leader of the Quds Force now should be hit?
There are a lot of options out there. I wouldn't, if I were giving advice to the president, I wouldn't rule out anything, geographic or otherwise, as we consider this, the response that we need to make now. But we do need to understand that it needs to be something that's going to change behavior. And our responses to date have manifestly not changed their behavior.
General McKenzie, thank you so much for joining us here on the program.
Thank you for having me.
Now, in the past few minutes, the American Department of Defense have released images of the troops who were killed in the strike. They have been named as Sergeant William Jerome Rivers from New Jersey, Specialist Breonna Alexandria Moffett from Georgia, and Specialist Kennedy Layden Sanders, also from Georgia. Now, let's bring in our panellists tonight. Bronwen Maddox, Chief Executive of Chatham House, and Michael Walker, Contributing Editor at Novara Media. Thank you both for joining us here on the programme. Michael, I'm going to come to you. Just hearing there from the General some of the options that they were laying out. And he said, we need to strike Iran and strike them hard. Just your response to that.
I mean, it's an absolutely terrifying interview. He says this is a region where they understand the use of force. I mean, how has that gone for the Americans over the past 20 years, right? You have $1 trillion spent in Iraq, hundreds of thousands of people dead. What did that cause? State collapse and the rise of ISIS. 20-year occupation of Afghanistan. If you don't win round the people of a country, the whole thing is going to collapse. And I think, there was a real elephant in the room there from what that general was saying, which is that the root cause of what we're seeing right now isn't Iran. It's the fact that the majority of the Middle East see what Israel are doing as a genocide, right? And you have got the Americans backing to the hilt the government doing that. And it just seems strange to me. You know, on Friday we had the International Court of Justice saying there's a plausible chance that what Israel is doing is genocide. We now have a situation where three American troops have been killed, and suddenly the problem is Iran. We need to hit back at Iran. It seems to me somewhat back to front.
Bronwen?
Some of the problem is Iran. But I completely agree with Michael. In fact, I think he understates the case that what the general was saying was it would lead to a calamitous situation in the Middle East. If there's anything that could make the situation worse, it would be something like a US attack on Iran. I actually don't think the Biden administration wants to do that, nor do I think Iran is trying to provoke that. But Iran is trying to keep the US and the West back on their heels by just stirring all these groups with which it has close links.
I mean, the US has said we're not looking for a war with Iran. But we're also seeing Senator Lindsey Graham, I think we can get it on the screen, the tweet that he put out, which was that hit Iran, hit them hard. I guess there are many in various different quarters in America who are saying we can't continue to allow this level of attacks on our troops, which has resulted in the death of these three service personnel.
I mean, I think if anyone goes into the next presidential election promising a war with Iran, it's not going to be a popular policy. But there is a risk of escalation, and in part it does come from popular opinion. As I say, I don't think this will be the case in America. But the idea that you have to strike back to seem hard. Now, that doesn't just apply to the Americans. It also applies to the Iranians. And what you've got across the Arab world, I mean, Iran's not part of the Arab world, but across the Middle East, the Muslim world, is you've got publics who are saying, we are seeing 26,000 of our brothers and sisters being killed. The West is doing nothing. You've said for years that you would stand up for the Palestinians against the Israelis. You need to do something. You know, the Houthis have really led the way when it comes to forcing consequences on Israel. And now Iran are really under pressure to act. So when everyone says, this is so provocative what they've done, obviously this wasn't Iran, it's sort of groups they support. But they are under pressure just as the US president is.
Go ahead, Bronwen.
This goes back years. I completely agree that one of the things that the US and other countries could most do for peace would be to try to push Israel and other parties towards some kind of deal, including for the Palestinians for a state, but that may be not immediate, to go into understatement. It's so easy, though, for the US, if it overreacts in any way, to make Iran the winner, as Iran has been for many years, including out of what the US did in Iraq.
So what should the Americans do at this point?
They should, if they do anything, and it is always an option to do nothing, something that they haven't always done in the past, but they possibly limited strikes if they can identify the particular group. But I think anything bigger than that really risks escalation of a kind that they could not begin to control.
And yet, overnight, we've heard from President Donald Trump, who has criticised the Biden administration for letting it get to this point where US service personnel are being killed as a result of a multitude of attacks. I mean, we could see a Trump 2.0 in the next 9 months. I
mean, we absolutely could. And I mean, why Biden, I think, is in a very vulnerable position is that the American policy isn't particularly coherent. It's to say we are going to back Israel to the hill while they commit what most of the Middle East sees as a genocide, and we're going to hope it doesn't expand. So now they're in a situation where they say, the Houthis are blocking shipping in the Red Sea. What are we going to do? We're going to try and bomb them out of existence. Well, by the way, the Saudis tried to do that for 8 years. Now they're saying we're going to let Israel continue with this potential genocide, even after this ICJ ruling. The Iranians, or people who are supported by the Iranians, obviously are going to feel like they have to respond in some way. And Biden's like, well, we won't respond to that, but we'll keep supporting the Israelis unless you get a ceasefire, which is the root cause of the immediate crisis we're seeing in the Middle East. Then I think Biden is, he's rowing without a paddle, right? And that will give opportunities to Donald Trump.
But Trump has been so consistent in saying, I want to take America out of wars. This is a really mistaken use of American energy, wealth, all these things, American lives. He's not bound by consistency, either in office or running for office. So there's nothing to stop him goading Joe Biden now and saying you should have stopped all this. But I would still be surprised if his instinct was to get further into exactly the kind of conflict he said he doesn't think America should be in. Well, in a moment, we'll be talking more about US strategy in the Middle East, so do stay with us, because coming up, we'll hear about the hopes for a ceasefire in Gaza, as our panellists have been talking about. That's as 3 young Gazans describe the reality of life inside a war zone.
I'm Dan Whitehead and I'm Sky News' West of England correspondent. From fishing communities to bustling cities, we spend every day reporting from across the region.
Welcome back. Now, according to Gaza's health ministry, more than 26,000 Palestinians have now been killed since October the 7th. Millions of people have been displaced, with many forced to move several times due to the growing scale of Israel's ground operation. We asked young Gazans, Odey, Mohammed and 9-year-old Lama, to film what it's like living in a war zone. Here's what they sent us.
أنا اسمي لاما أحمد أبو جاموس عمري 9 سنوات أنا زحت من غزة على خان يونس ومن خان يونس على رفح.
I'm Odey Bashir, 21 years old, from the occupied Palestine, Gaza Strip.
Hi everyone, this is Muhammad from Gaza and now it's 8:30 p.m. and I'm still alive.
That's a normal day now. Heading to the markets. We used to be 80,000 people, you know? Now 800,000 people. Big difference, huh? I keep losing friends day by day. I don't know what to do. I cry about him, but there is no time to grieve here in Gaza. Everyone knows that. You feel sad, you cry, okay, get up, go find water and food.
Finally I arrived to the well. So this water that we get from this well is not suitable for drinking. Even though there is some people use it for drinking because it's difficult to get the drinking water here.
بصحى وبنام على صوت القصف على المدفعيات والطخ والزنانات هم بصحونا من النوم.
We're still living this nightmare. It's like I hope I wake up tomorrow and this will all be just a dream.
I want to show you the view and how much people are here in this area. You can see how many tents. This tent in one of the camps in Rafah. As you can see, with my family, 2 brothers and 2 sisters. That's the door. The bad thing here, the cold nights. Last night, I almost freezed. It's too cold here.
الخيمة ما بتسعنا احنا عدد كبير اما الخيمة كل اشي بصير فيه فيش مية ولا اكل ولا شرب ولا حمام ولا مطبخ ولا اي اشي.
Today we took my grandma to the hospital because she was sick and some huge problems, but we're now home because we couldn't continue doing all of the tests due to the lack of equipment, staff, and we still hope for the best, hoping for a ceasefire like always, and hope we will stay alive.
شعوري مش حلو. احنا نفسنا نرجع بيتنا، واحنا نفسنا انه تخلص الحرب، واحنا نفسنا انه تخلص الحرب على خير ونرجع بيوتنا امنين.
Some of the young voices from our Gaza Diaries series. Bronwen, it's utterly devastating, the situation there at the moment.
It is just awful. They put words to it, but you almost can't. This is 85% of the population of Gaza displaced. This is death and misery on a huge, huge scale. There were not many countries who would have said on October 7th that Israel didn't have a right to respond to the awful attacks on it. But it is these kind of numbers and pictures and stories that explain why Israel has lost pretty much a lot of the world's support.
And yet we're seeing the largest UN agency in Gaza, a lot of funding being pulled out because of concerns around a number of people within working within UNRWA, having links to October the 7th. But just the fact that the humanitarian situation there right now is just devastating.
Well, I mean, I suppose to relate this to our previous conversation, the reason there are such severe tensions in the Middle East right now is because everyone can see these pictures, right? This is what the International Court of Justice has said has plausible characteristics of a genocide being live streamed in real time. And you can't expect that to happen and it not to have a fallout, a spill-out effect. And as for these sort of claims about UNRWA, I mean, I know many people were just absolutely shocked and appalled this weekend that you saw, as I said, the International Court of Justice give this ruling to say, one, there is a plausible case that Israel is breaching the Genocide Convention, and there are risks that they will go further. People thinking maybe that will cause the West to take a step back, for the United States and Britain to say, oh, maybe we should be putting more pressure on Israel to conduct this war in a different fashion. Instead, what they did is jump on the bandwagon of, I think, a really appalling smear, actually, of UNRWA. I mean,
there is this concern.
I really don't agree with you on this. I think the allegations against UNRWA, all right, just 12 people out of the 13,000 they employ in Gaza, might seem a small number, but these are pretty severe allegations. Not that they were sympathetic to Hamas, but that they took part in and supported the October 7th assault on Israel. And that is something that has to be investigated. And to cut off aid to UNRWA, which has been a long-running row between many of its donors about how it was using the aid and is it to good purposes or not, it's gone on for years. To cut that off doesn't mean that no aid gets in. I think where the argument should be at the moment is with Israel and Egypt to let the aid in. There are other UN agencies there that can distribute the aid, although UNRWA is the biggest one. But, this does need investigating. These are serious allegations, as UNRWA has said.
Well, so I think there are two issues here. So one is how to get the aid in, which is of the utmost importance.
And many countries give it directly. India, Turkey and so on, give it directly. It doesn't have to be UNRWA.
I do also think it is not a coincidence that we had the International Court of Justice read out a ruling about Israel, which relied a lot, actually, on UN organisations and their testimony about the horrific conditions in Gaza. And you have Israel who's constantly saying, oh, the UN, that's Hamas. The UN, you cannot trust them. And now suddenly we're all debating whether UNRWA are terrorists because 12 people out of 13,000.
Yes, but there needs to be an investigation.
Oh, of course, UNRWA is investigating. But the idea that you pull the funding...
You're quoting the ICJ as if the ICJ has delivered a judgment. It hasn't. That will take years. What it said was it brought out some... It assented to the provisional request for provisional action.
There's a plausible case that they've breached the genocide.
In order to look at it over several years. It said, all right...
But this is not an everyday occurrence.
There's enough there
to rare that this happens.
I've already said I don't agree with what is going on there, but I don't think you're quoting the court properly as
I'm quoting the court what they said, which is that they read out a lot of statements from UNRWA and UN agencies talking about the catastrophe in Gaza, and that wasn't just to say there's a plausible case that the Genocide Convention has been breached. It was to highlight the risk, the vulnerability of Gazans right now, of Palestinians.
Yes, that is the bit they were absolutely clear on, and said various things that about Israel having to take immediate action to try and reduce loss of
Yes.
life and so on, but they have not made a judgment on what Israel is doing beyond saying there's enough for them to look at it.
Yeah, Bronwen, Michael, we will keep you here. We've got lots more to discuss on the programme. Next up, to the rest of the day's news, and Prince Harry is being urged to quit as director of a land conservation charity. I'll hear from the campaign group who say Indigenous people in Congo are being routinely abused. A wildlife charity which has Prince Harry as a board member is investigating allegations of human rights abuses by its guards in the Republic of the Congo. African Park said it had been made aware of the allegations last year after a letter from human rights organisation Survival International. The Duke of Sussex is also a former president of the non-profit organisation which manages 22 national parks across 12 countries. The investigation has looked into allegations of abuse against local Baka people who live around an area managed by African parks in the Congo. Here's how one man described his experience.
They come here to beat people with machetes. They make people get undressed until the person is naked without any clothes at all. They make him or her get on their hands and knees and beat them with machetes. And they take water and pour it over them. Even if the person is holding a child, they'll pour water on them.
The testimony there of one person. Well, let's speak live to Caroline Pearce, the Executive Director of Survival International. Caroline, thank you very much for joining us here on the programme. We've heard these allegations. These allegations go back about a decade.
At least a decade. That's how long we've been speaking to African parks about this. And that's how long they've told us that they've been aware of abuse and aware of these allegations. And that's why it's long past time that something happens, that there is a fundamental shift that ensures that this model of conservation that is rooted in injustice and that leads on to these kinds of human rights abuses is ended.
Yeah, and we can talk about the model in a moment because, of course, Prince Harry is on the board of African parks, and there are calls now for him to step down. Do you think it'll make a difference?
We hope it will make a difference. He has a huge public platform. He's spoken out against racial injustice, environmental injustice. We need significant public pressure. We need the funders to stop funding this form of conservation, or organisations that are practicing a model of conservation that leads to this kind of horrific, appalling abuse of people who have done nothing wrong. And we do hope that by using his public platform, his influence, his profile, that we can really shake things up and finally see meaningful change.
And when we talk about meaningful change, I mean, you spoke about the model there. There is an investigation now taking place. Do you firstly think the investigation will make a difference? And also, what is it that the victims want?
What the victims want is freedom to access their land. This is, the Baka hunter-gatherer people. They are the indigenous people of the Congo Basin rainforest. They have lived there. They and their ancestors lived there for thousands of years. They have cared for this forest. They have depended on this forest. And now there is a conservation organisation managing their land. They're told it's a national park, and they're told to keep out. And they're not only told to keep out, there are armed, militarised guards employed to keep them out. And as we heard from your intro, they do so very violently. My colleagues have spoken to people who've been out, gathering honey in the forest, seized by guards, stripped, tortured, simply for trying to live their lives. So what they want is access to their land and their land rights recognised. And that's what we are calling for.
Caroline, thank you so much for joining us there on the programme. Well, let's bring in Michael and Bronwen. Michael, some really serious allegations there.
Yeah, very very allegations that will need to be investigated properly. It's an interesting story. There is a sort of, you could think of it as a caricature of the conservation movement, but it seems to be mainly borne out in reality here, which is you're more interested in protecting forests and animals than people. And you have these Western funders who put a fence around the forest, say, we've protected the forest, but the indigenous people have to go elsewhere. And the idea that you've got an organisation with these allegations, which at the same time is headed by a British royal, it seems almost like a caricature or a parody of the critique that people make of conservation.
I think Prince Harry can now use his fame, which it is, to press the organisation African Parks for a real investigation. It sounds like they've embarked on an investigation, and in fact, I think they said an independent lawyer, and haven't concluded that yet. But these are really serious allegations. He should be, the first to say so and express his sympathy with anyone who's suffered that, but then push, as a board member, if you like, and a former president, to find out what has been going on.
They say that they flagged this with him some time ago, and while he said he would push for an investigation...
Who said they...
Survival
did, but not African Parks, which he was on the board of.
Yes, exactly. Survival International say that they have raised this with Prince Harry. He said he'd look into it, and then they feel nothing happened.
I'm not party to private conversations between Prince Harry, despite what Prince Harry thinks about the media. But he is clearly in a position now with a long contact with this organisation to say what has been going on. And if he did take those allegations to the board before and they said, we've looked into it, well, is he satisfied now that was done properly? And can he say that in public?
Well, I'm not so sure how surprised we should be that a member of the royal family wasn't a particularly proactive board member on these organisations. I'm not sure how many organisations he is the president or the board member of, because you're really there to give it prestige and publicity, aren't you? Which, as you say, is why he would have leverage
He does now have
changes.
leverage.
He does have leverage,
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah.
Potentially, he didn't act soon enough, but at the same time, it's not a real job, is it?
But I mean, there are those who are saying, look, could cause him reputational damage, given the sorts of things that he champions.
Yeah, I'm sure it could. As we said, an investigation will need to be done. Perhaps this will make sort of the royal family and the idea of sort of becoming, because it benefits both organisations, doesn't it? It benefits the organisation that they can say there's a member of the royal family on our board, and then it benefits the member of the royal family or any other celebrity who can say, I'm doing all of this good because I sit on all of these boards of all of these charities, which they fundamentally don't have much idea what they're doing, and then sometimes it will backfire.
Well, we're going to continue our conversation. We're going to take it elsewhere in a moment. Do stay with us, because in a moment we'll be talking about Native Americans in film. I've been speaking to Oscar nominee Lily Gladstone about her campaign to get her people's history taught in schools and showcased on screen.
I went through a similar experience where I was sentenced to the electric chair. I remember the judge telling me I was going to be taken to the Rockview State Prison where 2,200 volts of electricity would course through my body and in my life. And then they changed it and made it lethal injection. So I wasn't ever sentenced to be stabbed with a needle, but they changed it. And that's what they're doing here. So what's bothering me, is troubling me, is they tried to execute this man for hours with needles. Imagine laying on a gurney and they're poking you in your groin, in your neck, all over your body, trying to get a vein to murder you, and you succeed in surviving that, only to be an experiment like a guinea pig. So this is horrifying that the state of Oklahoma and the state of Mississippi are going to start doing this, because successfully, opponents of the death penalty stopped them from getting the drugs. I'm so grateful that I went to death row, because all my childhood friends died of drug overdoses or violence or suicide, and I was spared the AIDS epidemic, and I started to learn self-respect and self-love. And I elevated my entire life because I was on death row. And even though I was there wrongly, it didn't matter. I needed to use that opportunity. I was physically tortured for years for being a rapist murderer they thought was mentally ill. I went through a lot of degradations, but I learned when people are harming you, you can really find it within yourself at that moment to love you. I was suffering from hepatitis C infection after they beat me and broke my teeth in prison, and I contracted this illness that was killing my fellow prisoners. So after listening to them die in horrifying fashion with the nurses taunting them, I asked that my appeals be dismissed and my lawyers be dismissed so that I could be executed. I spent 23 years in solitary confinement. That means every day of my life I was locked up 23 hours a day while I was being openly tortured. They took me off of death row and they put me in a mental cell because they feared I was going to kill them for what they did to me. So I spent the last 8 months of my life in prison in a mental ward being told that no human being could endure what we did to you without you being angry enough to kill one of us. So we're not going to trust you until we open the door.
Welcome back. She's the front runner to win Best Actress at this year's Oscars, and if she does, Lily Gladstone will make history as the first Native American winner. Earlier, I sat down with the star of Killers of the Flower Moon. I started by asking her why representation at the Oscars is so important.
Yeah, It's restitution. It's long overdue in many of these cases. It's, you know, it hasn't always been that we've been excluded from the center of, you know, filmic storytelling. It was in the wake of, in the United States, the Great Depression and World War II, that the cowboy-driven Western rose. It shifted to fit what the American populace wanted to see about themselves. So being at this point in history, it's taken 96 years to get here, when the origin of film in the United States was Native people making stories about ourselves.
But do you feel this was told from the perspective of white man? And therefore, I mean, I know you're at the center of it, and
people want to attribute that this is a white man telling it. It was a white man helming it, but Marty is so remarkable because everything about him as an artist is in service of the story that he's telling, is in service of the characters in it. So he gets out of the way. When he realizes that he can't answer the question, and he knows he can't. Like, he was so insistent and, like, you know, enthusiastic about having meetings with Osage people who corrected maybe a fault in the script. And as soon as there was something identified, oh, we got to change this. We got to find something else to place in it.
What
was that?
That's how you are.
I don't know what you said, but it must have been Indian for handsome devil.
I mean, the characters were so complex, and you learn so much about, you know, the flaws that we have as humans within ourselves. But if you could just speak to the story of the Osage people, did you know about this particular story growing up? Were you familiar with it?
Not in terms of it being the reign of terror. I had taken a very special interest as a child in Maria Tallchief, America's first prima ballerina, who was Osage from Fairfax, Oklahoma. She and her sister Marjorie, very renowned ballerina. But I do have a very vivid memory of being worried that Maria Tallchief's family may have been hurt by this. And I also have a very vivid memory of my dad telling me that Osage had enough money that if they bought a Rolls Royce and it ran out of gas, they would just go buy another car. But,
I mean, I wonder if, you know, through your experience with this film, and I guess America learning a little bit more about its own history, whether you think that this should be taught at schools and, you know, through your kind of understanding now of this bit of history.
It's unfortunately a history that, while it really must be taught, especially in the place where it originates, it's essentially lightly banned in Oklahoma from being taught. In a lot of places in the United States that are afraid of including things like this in their curriculum, maybe afraid of including, it's not the right word, but legislation has been created to to intimidate teachers away from teaching these histories, and, you know, in fear of losing their teaching license. So having the film there where people can access it, have curiosity about it, seek it out on their own. And I mean, if there's a children's reader's version of this book, then it absolutely deserves to be in the curriculum.
Lily Gladstone there. Well, my panel remains with me. Michael, did you watch the film?
I haven't done my research. I haven't watched this one, but I would like to. It's interesting that it could be the first Native American woman to win it. I remember the big controversy when they announced the nominations was that Margot Robbie wasn't nominated for Barbie, and you had this huge outrage. They're not nominating the women for Barbie. Well, you know, if the first Native American woman wins in that category, I wonder if sort of Hillary Clinton will be quietly deleting her Margot Robbie tweet.
Bronwen, you watched it though.
I did watch it. It was very long, but I thought she was brilliant. Sorry, Leonardo DiCaprio. I played her husband. No, I thought it was terrific. And the message at the end, right at the end, was that these murders, these offences, these attempt thefts of Osage land rights were all buried.
Yeah.
brushed away.
A great film, but 3.5 hours long. Bronwen, Michael, thank you so much for joining me. Well, we'll know soon whether Lily Gladstone will be the first Native American to win an Oscar. But let's end the programme as we began with that difficult decision facing the US president. He's promised retaliation. Everyone in the region, including Iran, is watching and waiting. We'll be discussing more tomorrow night. Next up, it's News at 10.